I knew my new neighbors were going to be a problem the second I heard the chainsaw, and it wasn't even 7 in the morning yet. I remember laying there half awake thinking maybe the city was trimming branches near the road or something. But then I looked out my kitchen window and saw a guy I'd never met standing in my backyard lined with safety glasses on, cutting into one of my oak trees like he owned the place. That was the moment this whole thing started. And honestly, if he had just apologized right there, none of what happened after would have happened. I live outside Asheville, North Carolina, in one of those older neighborhoods where everybody's yards kind of blend together because the trees are so huge. Most of the houses were built in the 70s. Lots of brick ranch homes, long driveways, kids riding bikes around after dinner. It's the kind of place where people wave at each other even if they don't actually know each other's names. And my trees. Those trees were a big part of why I bought the place. There were 6 massive white oaks running along the property line between my yard and the house next door. Beautiful trees, probably older than both houses combined. In the summer, they shaded almost my entire backyard, and during fall, the leaves turned this deep burnt orange color that honestly made the whole property look like something out of a magazine. My late wife loved those trees. We used to sit under them every evening with iced tea while our dog chased squirrels around the fence line. So yeah, they mattered to me more than just financially. After my wife passed, I stayed in the house mostly because of those memories. For about 3 years, the place next door sat empty after the older couple who lived there moved to Florida. Then, sometime in early March, a moving truck finally pulled up. Young couple, expensive SUV, 2 little boys. The husband looked like the kind of guy who talked with his hands too much and always sounded like he was pitching somebody an investment opportunity. His name was Grant Holloway. I met him the second day they moved in because he walked over while I was getting my mail. Real friendly at first, too. "Hey man," he said, sticking his hand out. "Grant, sorry in advance if the boys get loud." I laughed and told him I'd survived raising 2 daughters, so noise didn't scare me anymore. Then he looked up at the trees. Not casually either, like really studying them. "Those things block a ton of sunlight," he said. I remember shrugging. "That's kind of what trees do." He laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. More like he was filing the comment away somewhere in his head. About a month later, I noticed the first cuts. At first, it was subtle. A few branches missing over the fence line. Honestly, I didn't think much of it because neighbors are allowed to trim branches hanging over their yard in North Carolina as long as they don't damage the actual tree. I figured maybe he hired somebody and they got a little aggressive. But then I walked closer. The cuts weren't clean. Whoever did it had hacked into limbs way too close to the trunk. Some of the bark was torn. One branch had split under its own weight before it came down, leaving this long, ugly wound running down the side of the tree. I just stood there staring at it, feeling this weird mix of anger and disbelief building in my chest. You gotta understand, mature oak trees aren't little shrubs you replace at Home Depot for $80. These things take generations to grow. You don't just butcher them because you want more sunlight for your patio furniture. So I walked next door and knocked. Grant answered holding a coffee mug like we were about to have some normal suburban conversation. I said, "Hey, did you cut branches off my trees?" And without even hesitating, he goes, "Yeah, they were hanging over my yard." No apology, no hesitation, nothing. I told him trimming overhang on his side was one thing, but he crossed onto my property and cut limbs attached to my side of the trees too. And this guy actually smirked at me. Then he said, "Come on, man. It's the same tree. You're acting like I bulldozed your house." That right there. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about trees anymore. It was about entitlement. I told him those trees were valuable, and he couldn't just damage somebody else's property because he felt like it. He took a sip of coffee and said, "They'll grow back." Like that settled it? Then he hit me with the line I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "Honestly, the yard looks better already." And then he closed the door in my face. I stood there on his porch for maybe 10 seconds after that, just hearing the latch click behind the door while my blood pressure climbed into another dimension. Part of me wanted to pound on the door again. Another part of me wanted to drag him into the backyard and make him look at what he'd done, limb by limb. But instead, I went home, sat down at my kitchen table, and called an arborist. Because if there's one thing age teaches you, it's this: never fight emotional battles with emotional decisions. Sometimes the best revenge starts with paperwork. The arborist came out 2 days later. This older guy named Walter who looked exactly like every tree expert should look. Gray beard, faded work boots, coffee thermos, riding shotgun in his truck. The second he stepped into my backyard, he already had that expression on his face, like a doctor walking into an emergency room knowing the patient made some very bad choices. He spent almost an hour inspecting the damage, took photos, measured cuts, scraped bark with this little folding knife he carried around. Every few minutes he'd mutter things under his breath like, "Jesus," or "Whoever did this had no idea what they were doing." That actually made me feel worse somehow. At one point, he walked over to the biggest oak near the center fence line and put his hand against the trunk. Then he looked back at me and said, "This one's the problem." I asked what he meant. He pointed at a massive limb scar about 8 feet up. "See how close they cut to the collar? They removed the tree's natural defense zone. Moisture gets in there now. Insects too. Could take years, but this kind of damage spreads." Then he said something that honestly pissed me off more than anything Grant had said. These trees were healthy. Not are healthy. Were. Walter estimated the treatment and monitoring alone could cost a few $1,000s over time, and if one of the trees declined or died completely, replacement value for mature white oaks in our area could go way past that. I asked him if he'd put everything in writing. He smiled a little and said, "Neighbor problems?" I laughed once through my nose. "You could say that." That night I sat at my dining room table reading through the report while rain tapped against the windows. The whole house smelled like old paper and coffee. I remember staring out at those trees thinking about my wife again, how she used to complain every fall about raking leaves but still refused to let me hire anybody because she said the trees were part of the house's soul. It sounds stupid saying that out loud now, but after she died, those trees became weirdly personal to me. They were proof time had passed without taking everything, and some guy who'd lived next door for 6 weeks decided he could carve pieces off them because they blocked his sunlight. So I wrote Grant a letter. Not angry, not threatening, just direct. I attached the arborist report, explained the damage, requested reimbursement for treatment costs, and politely told him to stop touching my property moving forward. I even put in a line saying I wanted to resolve things peacefully between neighbors. No response, not even an acknowledgement. Then about 2 weeks later, things got worse, way worse. It was a Saturday morning around 7:15 when the chainsaw woke me up again. Only this time it sounded closer, aggressive. I threw on jeans, walked outside, and immediately felt my stomach drop. Grant was standing on a ladder with a rental chainsaw cutting the top off one of the oaks, not trimming, not pruning, topping it. Huge sections were crashing into his backyard while his kids watched from the patio eating cereal like it was Saturday morning entertainment. I yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" He shut the saw off and looked down at me irritated, like I was interrupting him. "Fixing the shade problem," he said. I walked right up to the fence. "You're destroying that tree." And this guy, I swear to God, actually rolled his eyes. "It's a tree, Ethan. Relax." That was the first time he used my name like that. Casual, condescending, like I was some dramatic old man making a fuss over landscaping. I pointed at the ladder crossing onto my side of the property line and told him if he touched another branch I was calling the police. And then his wife came outside. Her name was Melissa, quiet woman, barely spoke whenever I'd seen her before. But now she looked embarrassed, genuinely embarrassed. "Grant," she said softly, "maybe we should just stop." He snapped back without even looking at her. "I'm almost done." The silence after that felt heavy. Even his kids stopped talking. I went back inside before I said something I'd regret. But my hands were shaking so badly I spilled coffee trying to pour a cup. I remember standing there in my kitchen listening to the chainsaw outside thinking, this guy honestly believes there are no consequences for anything. That afternoon, Walter came back out after I called him again. The second he saw the top tree, he just closed his eyes. "You don't top white oaks," he said quietly. "Apparently topping stresses the tree so badly it can trigger rapid decay, weak growth, disease, sometimes total structural failure years later." He estimated the damage alone on that single tree could become catastrophic long term. Then he looked at me and asked, "You planning to take legal action?" And that's where something shifted in my head. Because up until then, I'd still been trying to solve this like neighbors. Calm conversations, documentation, letters. But Grant wasn't behaving like a neighbor. He was behaving like someone who thought rules only applied to other people. So that night, I started researching him. Not in some creepy movie villain way, just public records, LinkedIn, county property filings. Turns out Grant worked in real estate development down in Charlotte, mostly short-term renovation flips and investment properties. His social media was full of motivational quotes, drone shots of remodeled kitchens, and captions like, "Turning vision into profit." Then I found the interesting part. One of his posts literally mentioned the house next door. "Excited for our newest investment project. Full cosmetic update. Maximize value relist by Q4. Investment project." That's what my neighborhood was to him. Not a home. Not a community. Just numbers on a spreadsheet. And suddenly everything clicked. The obsession with sunlight. The constant contractors showing up. The rushed landscaping. The expensive cosmetic upgrades happening almost immediately after move-in. Grant wasn't planning to live here long. He was trying to increase curb appeal and property value fast. That's when I stopped thinking about revenge emotionally and started thinking strategically. See? Here's the thing people don't realize about house flippers. Their profit margins are fragile. One inspection problem, one permit issue, one delay, and suddenly the whole investment starts bleeding money. So I started digging. And man, once I started pulling that thread, the entire sweater came apart. The first thing I did was contact the city forestry department. I submitted photographs, Walter's report, property surveys, everything. A week later, a city inspector showed up at both houses. Turns out Asheville has protected tree ordinances for mature hardwoods over a certain diameter, meaning even on your own property. Major trimming or removal requires permits and approved methods. Grant had neither. The fine hit him for $1,800. I found that out because he stormed across my lawn holding the violation notice in his hand like he wanted to fight me. "You called the city?" he yelled. I was sitting on my porch drinking iced tea when he came over, which honestly made the whole thing feel weirdly satisfying. I looked at him and said, "You damaged protected trees." He laughed this angry little laugh and said, "You seriously reported me over branches?" And I remember setting my glass down and saying very calmly, "No, Grant. I reported you because you kept touching things that don't belong to you." For a second, I thought he might actually come through the fence. His face went red, jaw clenched, veins popping out of his neck. But then Melissa appeared behind him on their porch holding their younger son's hand. And the second Grant noticed his kid watching, he backed off. Before he walked away, he pointed at me and said, "Hope the trees were worth it." That line stayed in my head all night. Because the truth was, this had stopped being about the trees a while ago. This was about a man who thought money insulated him from consequences, finally running into someone who had the patience to prove otherwise. And I was just getting started. A lot of people think revenge happens in one big dramatic moment. Yelling, fists flying, somebody getting dragged away in handcuffs. Real revenge usually looks a lot quieter than that. It's paperwork, deadlines, inspectors, certified mail. It's watching someone slowly realize the rules they ignored actually apply to them after all. And once the city started looking at Grant's property, the rest happened almost by itself. See, during all my digging, I'd pulled the permit history for the house next door, mostly out of curiosity at first. But the deeper I looked, the stranger things got. The listing photos from when Grant bought the place showed this beautiful finished basement with recessed lighting, a custom bathroom, little built-in shelves, whooped straight out of HGTV. There was also a huge elevated deck in the backyard wrapped around the side of the house. Only none of it existed in county permit records. No basement conversion permit, no electrical permit, ODEC permit, nothing. Now, technically, the previous owner probably did most of that work years earlier. But here's the thing about buying an investment property. Once your name's on the deed, the problems become yours too. So I made one phone call to the county building department. I didn't exaggerate anything, didn't lie. I just asked if permits had ever been issued for the renovations advertised in the real estate listing. That was enough. About 10 days later, county inspectors showed up, and suddenly Grant's life got very expensive. The deck failed structural compliance because the footings weren't deep enough. Parts of the electrical work in the basement weren't up to code. One bathroom vent terminated inside the wall instead of outside the house, and the basement bedroom windows were too small to meet emergency egress requirements. Meaning, legally, you couldn't even market the basement as additional living space until everything was corrected. I'll never forget the look on Grant's face the day contractors started tearing apart that deck. He stood in the driveway with his hands on his hips, watching chunks of lumber get hauled away while rain clouds rolled overhead. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked tired instead of arrogant. And honestly, a small part of me almost felt bad. Almost. Then I looked at the oak tree he'd topped. Half the canopy still hadn't recovered. Branches were growing back uneven and twisted. The tree looked wounded, That feeling passed pretty quickly. The funniest part is Grant actually tried talking to me again after the inspection started. One evening, he walked over while I was pulling weeds near the mailbox. No attitude this time. No smirk. Just stress all over his face. He said, "Look, this has gotten out of hand." I remember laughing at that because the lack of self-awareness was unbelievable. Out of hand? Like I was the one cutting up somebody else's property with a chainsaw at sunrise. He rubbed the back of his neck and said the repairs were costing way more than expected. Tens of thousands already. He said holding costs, contractor delays, permit corrections. Everything was stacking up. Then he hit me with this line. "We're both adults here. Maybe we can stop escalating things." I stood there looking at him for a second, thinking about how many opportunities he'd had to stop this before it became a disaster. The first conversation at the door, the letter, the warning, the second chainsaw incident. Every single time, he doubled down. So I told him the truth. I was willing to be neighbors, I said. You decided you wanted to win instead. He looked away after that, and for the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't have a comeback. A few weeks later, we ended up in small claims court over the tree damage. Now, if you've never been to small claims court, it's way less dramatic than television. Mostly people arguing over fences, contractors, water leaks, stuff like that, but I came prepared. Walter testified about the damage. I had photographs from before and after the cutting, property surveys, certified letters, city violations, estimates for treatment and long-term monitoring. Grant tried arguing that the branches crossed into his yard and he thought he had the right to trim them. The judge stopped him almost immediately. "You had the right to trim responsibly on your side," she said. "You did not have the right to damage trees located on someone else's property." Simple as that. In the end, she awarded me $7,500. Not enough to replace what was damaged, but enough to make the point official. After court, Grant walked past me in a parking lot without saying a word. Melissa followed behind him carrying a folder against her chest. And honestly, she looked exhausted. Their boys weren't there that day, but I thought about them a lot afterward. Kids absorb tension even when parents think they're hiding it. By November, the house went up for sale. Fresh paint, new listing photos, fully updated, written across the description like none of the previous chaos had happened. But everybody in the neighborhood knew. Contractors had been in and out for months, inspectors everywhere, dumpster trailers parked outside half the summer. The whole street had watched the flip turn into a financial sinkhole in real time. The house eventually sold, but barely above what Grant originally paid before renovation costs, fines, legal fees, and repair work, which basically meant the profit he expected was gone, just erased. All because he couldn't respect a property line and a few old trees. Sometimes I sit on my back porch in the evenings and look at those oaks. Most of them recovered okay. The top one still looks uneven if you know what to look for, but Walter says it has a chance. A weird thing happened after all this too. The neighborhood changed a little. People started talking more, looking out for each other, sharing contractor recommendations, permit advice, property survey tips. It was like the whole mess reminded everyone that communities only work when people respect boundaries, literally and figuratively. As for Grant, I heard he went back to Charlotte after the sale fell flat. Never saw him again. And honestly, I don't hate the guy. I think he spent so much time treating houses like investments that he forgot homes belong to actual people, memories, families, grief, history. Those trees weren't just landscaping to me. They were part of my life. Still, every time I tell this story, somebody eventually says the same thing. You went too far. Maybe I did. Or maybe people like Grant only stop when consequences finally cost more than arrogance. I don't know. But I'll tell you this. Nobody on this street has touched another person's trees since. And honestly, I'm curious what you think. Was I justified for pushing back the way I did? Or should I have let it go after the first apology never came? Let me know in the comments, because this one still splits people right down the middle.